Hi, Luke. Okay. Yes, I suppose there was a particular moment that I became interested in Inle Lake. I was interested in thinking about ethnicity and how it relates to territory, and I had this idea about boundaries and borderlands as being an interesting space where that kind of relationship could be explored. And I think I was sort of more thinking about it theoretically rather than practically, and I was thinking about areas along the Myanmar-China border in parts of Shan State. But then sort of as I started to really think practically about the project itself, realized that for logistical and ethical reasons, it might be hard to easily do the type of research that you're able to in a PhD in those places. So I started having discussions with my supervisor about different locations that would sort of allow this idea to be explored. And Yangshui came up. The reason that it came up was because there are lots of different ethnic groups that live there. And
is this the village on Inle Lake?
Yes, sorry, the town that's sort of the gateway to Inle Lake. Yeah, an interesting territory where different ethnic groups are interacting and different sort of notions of territory are being experienced there. So that came up, and Jane Ferguson, my supervisor, gave me a DVD one day, and she was like, watch this, it'll tell you about Inle, you'll enjoy it, it's interesting. And at that point, I wasn't even thinking about tomatoes at all, but it was called The Floating Tomatoes by Mintin Kokoji. And I watched it and I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. And it wasn't just the territory stuff that I was captured by, but there was all this other stuff going on with tourism, land, economics, politics, and it just sort of was all happening around this one fruit. And so that was kind of the moment that I thought, yeah, this is an interesting space. And from there, I guess it evolved. And I guess your question about my experience as a child here, that's probably like the wider context that my research interests fit into, because growing up here, I guess I have a pretty special emotional connection to Myanmar. Yeah, I lived here from 2000 to 2005 during my elementary school years while my parents were working in the NGO sector. I experienced the country at a different time, but also I was a kid, so pretty different to my relationship to Myanmar now. But definitely having had those formative years here and then growing up back in Australia and always sort of longing for this place has been a big factor in, I think, how I've become interested in it intellectually and academically. Yeah, it's been a bit of a weird phenomenon for me experiencing that just in these first few weeks of quote-unquote field work, and suddenly a place that I've spent a lot of time in and have had a strong connection to and that has been familiar in certain ways. You know, am I now supposed to interact with it differently because it is the field? Is the field just a continuation of previous experiences? Like, these are sort of questions that I'm thinking about when I'm now interacting with Myanmar as a field site. Yeah, like, is it all field work? I don't know. Yeah. And even though, like, there is the familiarity in having spent time here throughout different points in my life, like, that doesn't mean it's not the same as being an insider. I've always been an outsider. I still am. Yeah, I guess there are some pre-existing relationships and connections that I have here that do make coming here easier. I'm sure many people in Myanmar would know that Inle Lake is the main tomato growing centre of Myanmar, but probably for a lot of foreigners and outsiders who come to Myanmar and visit Inle Lake as a tourist destination, they might not be aware of that. So yeah, it is the largest growing tomato centre, followed by Monua in the Sagaing region. And there was a report that came out, the Myanmar Times did a report a few years ago with some of the statistics about how much Inle Lake is producing and what cost they're selling the tomatoes for. And they estimated that around 1,900 buckets a day of tomatoes are produced, and each bucket weighs 48 kilos approximately. And so we're talking about 93,000 kilograms of tomatoes, and each bucket is sold from somewhere between 28,000 and 33,000 kyat. So that's about 60 million per day, which would be about 46,000 US dollars. And yeah, so these are statistics from 2015. So it'll be interesting for me to sort of find out what those numbers are now. But that's just to sort of give reference to the scale of the practice there. And why Inle? So several reasons, I suppose. The fact that these tomatoes are grown by ethnic farmers from the ethnic group known as the Intha, meaning sons of the lake. This is a water-dwelling ethnic group that occupies the lake, and they have a agricultural practice of growing agricultural produce on floating garden beds. And so tomatoes are grown on these floating garden beds where the roots are directly submerged in the water, and this allows for an extremely high yield of tomatoes. That practice is now an intensive farming practice, and it's pesticides and fertilizers are also used to aid the growth. But that's one reason why they're able to produce so many tomatoes. And so the geography is important, but also the question of ethnicity too, and the relationship to the tomatoes is something that I think is significant, and we'll be interested in actually testing and learning about. But is it important that tomatoes are grown in Inle because they're grown by Intha? That's part of the question of my research. Yeah, I'm not the first person to have looked at Inle Lake as a region of interest. Martin Michelon, who I know you interviewed earlier on this podcast, he's done quite extensive research on the globalization effects in and around Inle Lake, and he's written that the development of the national road network was a significant factor in intensifying the practice of growing tomatoes, because they could then be transported nationally and a market was opened, and that was in the 1960s. Though tourism to Inle probably didn't happen until the 1990s, so I'd say it's likely that there's been a gradual development there, but it's definitely not the ancient, ancestral, traditional practice that it's sold as to tourists. Yeah, definitely, because it's a big part of my project. The sort of context that I'm coming to this question from within Myanmar at the moment around the question of ethnicity, especially with contemporary issues at the moment, like such as the conflicts happening in Western Myanmar. The question of what constitutes an ethnicity or an ethnic group, which groups get recognised, which groups don't get recognised, and who gets to decide these things are very contentious questions. And so I want to step into how those questions are being asked and actually ask something about what ethnos or ethnicity means in a Myanmar context. So looking at the situation on Inle Lake, where you have this massive economy, which is being, the labour for this economy is coming from ethnic farmers, and the products that they are producing have a sort of ethnic symbolism. There's a question to be asked about the relationship between that system, those products, and the ethnic category that they are constructing or representing. I'm sort of looking at the tomato and the Intha agricultural livelihoods as both a mode of production and a site of cultural production, and asking if the practice of farming tomatoes on the lake creates or doesn't create ethnicity that is recognised as such. And I think that using the tomato, which is an object, a non-human, non-ethnic thing, as a vehicle to sort of explore this is interesting, because it provides insight into the sort of material relationships between objects and people, and symbols and identity. And I think that the movement that this commodity, object, fruit, symbol has through different networks, be that economic, political, and cultural, is quite unique. Yeah, definitely. It's a pretty important relationship for this question, because the presence of tourism in Inle Lake, in and around Inle Lake, really puts Intha livelihoods on display as a spectacle for touristic consumption. And the sort of presence of a touristic gaze definitely creates a space where Intha livelihoods, assume a sort of symbolic nature when they are being viewed and interacted with by tourists. And photo is a really interesting sort of part of the commodity relationship because it's part of the experience that is bought and sold. And I mean, we understand commodities as coming into existence when they meet, a moment of exchange. So thinking about how what images of these livelihoods and of this cultural group represent when they are, removed from the context where they are produced, and how they kind of acquire value is really interesting. And I guess maybe an example of that would be when I went to Inle Lake last year to visit I met a couple at my hostel over breakfast, and they had been in Inle a few days. I'd just arrived, and we were having a conversation, and I had said, "Oh, how have you enjoyed your time here? What's the lake like? I'm going to go out today. I haven't seen it yet. What did you think?" And they were like, "Oh, we were so disappointed. We came here and the only thing we'd really wanted to see was a fisherman on a boat with a traditional fishing basket, like we'd seen in all the pictures before we'd come here. And when we got to the lake, nobody had those fishing baskets. Everyone was using nets. And, we said to our boat driver, "Where are all the fishermen with the baskets?" And there were none in sight. And then, so that had been something that was really disappointing for them, to not have their expectations met in reality. But then what they said later on in the day was they were sort of finishing up their journey around the lake, and suddenly a fisherman with a fishing basket, just like they'd wanted to see, appeared in front of their boat and started doing all these really photogenic poses, and they got some amazing shots. They said they were the best shots they'd gotten, and they were like stoked finally, they'd gotten the experience they'd wanted. But then it was completely undermined for them when the fisherman turned around and asked them for money after they'd taken his photo. And for them, they hadn't considered that might be somebody's job. And the whole sort of question of authenticity came up. Oh, what we're seeing isn't real. But it definitely, for me, just highlighted the sort of particular relationship that exists between what is seen, what's consumed, and how it is part of the economy of tourism. One part of the story I forgot to mention was that they had said to me, look us up on Instagram. We've got an Instagram account of their travels throughout Myanmar. And I was like, oh yeah, and checked them out a couple of days later, kind of forgot about it, and saw that they had nearly 15,000 followers on their account, which is quite a lot. And scrolled down, I wanted to see if the picture of the fisherman had made it on there, given that it was so disappointing, And there was the photo of him, but instead of, the long story I had gotten about how it wasn't real, they just had a caption saying like, oh, these fishermen are so skillful of the way that they row their boats and collect their fish, or something like that. And so, yeah, the whole kind of illusion was maintained. And the interesting thing about the commodity value of that photo in this context is that once, on social media accounts, once you sort of reach a certain number of followers, you can actually start making money off of your account. So there's an interest in those types of images and what they represent being presented in the way that they are, because, yeah, there is a monetary transaction sort of element to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess the plan is to follow the tomato and see where that takes me. So I'm going to be in Yangon for the first couple of months, and I'm really interested in connecting with Yangon-based tomato vendors and looking at different sort of nodes along the commodity chain or network that the tomato travels through, that come through Yangon, as well as some of the tourism aspects to Inle as well that are based around Yangon, which is like less maybe directly related, but it'd be interesting to see, talk to some tour operators who've been in the business for a long time and might be able to shed some light on how things have changed over time. Then I'll head up to Nyangshui and really start my immersive fieldwork amongst the tomatoes and the farmers and the tourists and the hotel operators and the truck drivers who transport tomatoes and yeah, probably something I would recommend if anyone is interested in learning more about this topic would be to go and watch the documentary I mentioned earlier at the start of the episode, The Floating Tomatoes by Mintin Kokoji. It's online, so I'm sure it's easy to find. But yeah, it's just a really lovely sort of visual introduction to the topic and the environment and the complex social issues that people are experiencing around Inle Lake at the moment. So yeah, I would recommend that people give that a view. Thank you for having me.